Inflation targeting. The big thing with inflation targeting is we're going to see in chapter 16, and if you're interested, you could fast track to it. The reason why I still kept it at chapter 16 is to follow the textbook's logic, but also because a lot of the stuff that you'll want to know to understand it fully happens before, like in the few chapters before 16. So I still leave it till there. But the big thing with chapter 16 was we'll see is the main purpose of keeping inflation rates stable. So let's say we have a target of 2% per year on average. You wouldn't want to have inflation rates be at 0% one year, and then at 5% the other year, and then at 2%, then at 6%, then at 0 or -1, and so on. It would lead to a lot of problems in terms of inflation expectations and extra problems that arise, extra cost associated to inflation. So you want to keep a target that's pretty narrow and that you want to hit every year. It's not an average for many years. It's like this is the target every year. I have a certain broadness to it. So here our target is 1 to 3%, and that target gets revised, but since 1991 it's been our target. So that's the main reason. And we'll see the different costs of not having stable inflation when we come to chapter 16. So some people could ask in that whole 1 to 3% thing, well, why not like 0 to 2 or like -1 to 1 or something else? I think there's a potential problem, like I mentioned before, of having deflation. So trying to target inflation at 0%, which could be a goal, could be dangerous because when it goes slightly below, you might be slowing down economic activity. When it goes a little bit above, you're stimulating again. So it's kind of good to having a small positive amount. Also, we'll see later on when it gets to falling into a recession that if we had 0% inflation, it might take a long time to get out of the recession, because sometimes some recessions people have to start accepting lower wages. Having people accept lower wages will be very hard to have them swallow that pill. But if we think about having them keep their wages stable, such as what we had at the university at some point, having the wages kept stable over a few years and not go up with inflation, well, that's easier for people to swallow. They're like, well, we're keeping the same amount of money. But in reality, you're not. If you have like five years of like no growth and your wages, hourly wages, and there's been 2% inflation on everything, your purchasing power for every hour worked goes down. But that's easier to swallow than having people negotiate for lower wages. So I think 1 to 3% is a good target. 0 to 2% would also be good with that goal of 1%. But I'm not against that idea of 1 to 3. And the only reason I prefer it to the 0 to 2 idea is based on if we hit a recession and we want to have people accept lower wages to get out of it as quickly as possible. So what inflation are we targeting when we go through this process? Well, CPI inflation has a lot of volatile things, so we typically focus on core inflation, which is essentially, just think about it as consumer price index inflation, removing the volatile components. So you're just taking them out. And if we look at these next two tables, you could kind of see the difference between the two. The core inflation is this one that doesn't vary as much. The CPI one is the one that varies a lot more. If I look at the core one, I'm pretty much stayed in that 1 to 3% target and pretty close to the center all the way through. There's some moments where it goes a little bit higher, then it drops down, but essentially it's been hit on target pretty well. And this is just a graph from another textbook, from our textbook. I prefer the other one a little bit more. But again, you could see CPI inflation is changing a lot, and core inflation is that middle one, which doesn't vary as much. So essentially that's our goal. We'll see in the future that the Bank of Canada has to really work hard to do this, because when it conducts monetary policy, it takes them, they'll say, about a year before that monetary policy has full effect on the economy. And it takes about like up to a whole other year before that monetary policy has an effect on inflation. So they have to really make sure that what they try to do to stimulate the economy, that they foresee what's going to happen in the future, and to make sure that if they foresee that inflationary pressures are going up, they're going to have to slow down the economy, even though we haven't fully recovered, to make sure that we don't go beyond this 1 to 3% target. We'll get more on that later on. As I said, the last few chapters is really where everything tends to melt together and bond well together.